And it's episode 4 of T3F, tentative title, tentative format. The podcast that is eternally in development because the world's crazy and, nobody can commit to anything long term, especially me. So, I do this as it goes and kind of whatever comes to mind to do in it. And after that super smooth professional intro, we can get right to it. It's been a couple of weeks again because, as I just said, the world is crazy and things are always going on and changing and yada yada. Plus, things in my personal life sometimes kind of get in the way of doing this. Something that I hope, again, might happen less often as this thing grows. I don't want to get to the point where I'm on Patreon and I have people who actually support this podcast financially and then just like winging it. A little pet peeve of mine with content creators is content creators who kind of disappear for a while when they already have a system like this set up. I don't think like a YouTuber owes us anything. But I do think that when a YouTuber or other content creator, like, again, has people who are, for lack of a better term, like paying customers, then just disappearing and not saying where you are for several weeks and then coming back with a video just without any kind of explanation is just a little weird to me. When I stopped putting out content, I put my Patreon on freeze. I didn't feel comfortable. Even the meager couple of bucks that I was getting from people from doing a podcast occasionally and like Twitch streams, I was like, I don't want you to. Even $1, like if I'm not doing anything actively right now, just keep your money. Like, and I didn't have to close my Patreon. There's just a way to like shut off the money collection. So they're all still there. As a show of support and, as a way to say like, when you come back, we'll be there with you, which is great. Anyway, a bunch of stuff happened. There's a lot to talk about. I guess we could just dive right into it. The big thing that happened in the past 2 weeks was Biden's pick of vice president. Finally, after all of these speculations and the races, and we all know it's Kamala Harris or Kamala. The first thing we can talk about is her name, the mispronunciations of her name, and the inferences about why people mispronounce it. I guess there was some kind of controversy about Tucker Carlson called her Kamala Harris, and people said, of undertone of racism or dog whistles or whatever. I always called her Kamala, and I didn't even remember why, and then the reminder came around because it was the wrestler Kamala. There was a wrestler named Kamala, and that's how his name was spelled, Kamala. And he just died. And his last name was Harris for real, which was like even weirder. But when I saw that, I was like, oh, that's why I thought the name was pronounced like that. And I don't think I'm the only person. I mean, that was right around the time that I used to watch wrestling as a young kid, like in the early 90s, something like that. And I hadn't thought of that wrestler in, like 20 years. But like in my brain, I saw the name spelled like that and thought it was Kamala Harris. It kind of flows nice to say that more than Kamala, but again, that's her name, and as someone who has their own name mispronounced 95% of the time, I sympathize, and so like I guess I'll make an effort to say it right. And again, this is going to be controversial, I'm sure, as everything around her is going to be. Already the identitarian sabers are rattling. They're pre-writing their outrage articles about how people are going to attack her because she's a woman of color and all kinds of, and they're breaking out the lists of words that imply bigotry Now all kinds of adjectives now just mean things. Nasty is suddenly something that has never been said about a male politician, which is just a ridiculous assertion. But it's just going to dominate the conversation because there are large segments of the left who don't know another way to deflect criticism. And in their defense, it's proven to be an effective tactic. For the most part, I think, I think Trump himself and the Trump administration have proven in many ways immune to identitarian attacks in ways that the right was not beforehand. Like a President Romney would have absolutely fired people, apologized, done all kinds of things in response to racial outrage. And I know a lot of people will hold that against Romney, but I also think it's just a product of the times. I think that Trump just changed a lot about our political landscape. A lot of other people now act in ways that are way outside of the realm of what they would have done in the pre-Trump days. And, and you can pin that on Trump. I was talking about that on Twitter this morning. Somehow people inferred that I meant that Trump made people behave poorly when I meant the Trump era turned people into people who are disgusting, because people were saying really nasty things about Trump because his brother just died. And it's just I don't even fault people for having the instinctive thought oh, you hate someone so much and you hear that something awful happened to them and the first thought in your brain is good or something like that. We're all human, but to then sit down and compose tweets about it, put them out there in the world and feel good about it, not regret it enough to delete it and revel in the clout and the clicks and the the attention, the virality. That's weird. That's really weird. And I was saying maybe take a minute to think about whether or not you were always a person, you were always this kind of person, and if you weren't, whether you want to stay this kind of person, whether the Trump era made you into a person you want to be more like or you want to be less like. I think that's a reckoning a lot of people are going to have in the next, decade. And we'll see. I've been saying for a couple of years that I'm very interested to see what a post-Trump political world will look like. What aspects of him will just stay around forever, even though he is singularly unique in the modern political landscape. Even a lot of Trumpist politicians are more politician-y. I don't know how to explain it, but a Josh Hawley or a Matt Gaetz, they're more normative, quote unquote, in a DC way, even if they're way extreme. I mean, it's not like Washington hasn't had extreme right wing and extreme left wing politicians in government, but they still kind of acted in a way that was, again, normal is hard to use here, but there isn't much more to say about how outside of what we knew Trump is, how outside of that mold of politics he was and is. But back to Kamala and related controversies, I was gonna segue into something related to that and culture war issues. Jenna Ellis, who's a campaign advisor for Trump, said that Kamala sounded like Marge Simpson, which, again, went on Twitter and blah, blah. And, of course, there were all kinds of memes about it and stuff. And then the Simpsons, the official Simpsons account, tweeted out a video in which Marge Simpson herself kind of comments on this and basically tells Jenna Ellis to go fuck herself in so many words. And it was, that one went, everywhere and was super viral. And I thought, first of all, I cringed extremely hard at that. And it also felt so petty. And I said on Twitter, it felt like a show of cultural dominance. And people said, well, The Simpsons is no longer relevant. And I said that's true, but the character of Marge Simpson is sort of an iconic pop culture character. And I said that it's a way of showing cultural dominance. It's a way of saying, oh, you're going to reference Marge Simpson. We're going to bring out the actual Marge Simpson to tell you to go fuck yourself because the culture is ours. We own the culture. We have the power to do that. There is no we, obviously. The we here is like a general ideology. It's the creators of The Simpsons in this case, and it's something else in another case. Someone said it would be as though someone in the Trump campaign like used an Office meme, and then Steve Carell would record a thing in character to say, don't use me for your whatever. And that similar stuff has happened before. I think people from Glee were like, don't use my meme, or all kinds of stuff like that. But again, like I said, it's this idea of like, we own this. Paul Ryan can't like Rage Against the Machine because Rage Against the Machine are going to tell Paul Ryan to go fuck himself. And if Jenna Ellis is going to come out and say like, oh, Kamala sounds like Marge Simpson, which as an aside is like a dumb comment because A, no, she doesn't, and B, what a random comparison. But then to like march the cartoon character out to be like, well, I don't sound like Kamala Harris, and I hate Republicans, and fuck you. Just want to let that horrible impression sit for a minute. But I said the thing that it reminded me of is Scott Tenorman Must Die, an old classic South Park episode in which Cartman is going to take the ultimate revenge against Scott Tenorman, who is a bully from school. And long story short, he ends up eating his own parents in a meal. But one of the things that Cartman does to him is this kid really likes Radiohead, and Cartman gets Radiohead to come and like laugh at him when he's crying, and laugh and point at him, and just to crush him because they feel like he loves Radiohead. And that's exactly what I thought when this happened. It just felt like this malicious, I'm gonna ruin this person. And I'm not saying Jenna Ellis loves Marge Simpson. I'm just saying in general, like it's a keep your hands off our culture kind of statement. And additionally, like the Jenna Ellis comment, she either planned to say this or she did it off the cuff, right? If she did it off the cuff, it was literally 2 seconds out of her life. If she thought about it beforehand, it was 30 seconds? Meanwhile, this Simpsons clip had to be like conceived. The script had to be written for it. It needed to be voiced and recorded, animated. Someone had to put it all together, like mix it or whatever, and render it. It had to be cleared with their legal department. There's no way something like this went out without at least being sent to a lawyer so that they can like watch it and say like, yeah, this is fine. That turns it into it's like this is like a sanitized corporate product. This isn't a cartoonist, because if this was some cartoonist who could just like quickly whip up a cartoon, again, the sentiment is the same to me. It's like we own the culture. But in this case, it wasn't like a creator, a singer. This isn't like Neil Young saying to Trump, don't use the song that I wrote. This is more, again, an abstract corporate entity or an abstract cultural identity using an imaginary character in order to like bite back against Trump, by way of this surrogate. And I found that incredibly cringy and also kind of like petty and just fucking ignore it. Like, really? You had to turn it into a thing? But again, the problem is stuff like this gets a ton of publicity and a ton of love, and people fist bump, and it's just like, it encourages and normalizes this, and it's just depressing. I just think it's terrible. It's really dumb. And from that, we can move on. I think I'm going to touch on a couple of different topics kind of briefly. There are things I don't want to go into a ton, like this next topic, but I feel like I really have to comment on it a little because I know a little about it and it's a little close to me. It's the Israel and UAE peace agreement, normalization agreement. I don't know. They didn't really call it a peace accord in the way that like the Jordan thing was a peace accord, the Egypt thing was a peace accord. That might still be like the title if they end up doing like a White House lawn thing, a la the Clinton era, a la the Carter era. But I just wanted to say a couple of different things on it. Actually, I was going to respond to a couple of the big criticisms of it, because the interesting thing about this is that, the peace camp, the camp that is mad that Israel is isolated and by extension also mad that like the U.S. isn't a leader in the Middle East in the way that Obama was. It's weird that people think that that's what he was. But again, let's move on from this. I just want to comment a little on the discussion. It would be better to do that if I had like an interlocutor, if I had someone here who was opposed to it, and a bunch of people I interact with have a lot to say about this, and a lot of their criticisms are not unmerited, but I still think that they are they overlook a really important aspect of it. And so one of the main criticisms here is, it's just between the governments. Either the government or the governments, meaning like either somebody claims that it's just the UAE's, royal family and ruling elite that are doing this, and the people are very much against it. And other people think that that's also true on the Israeli side, meaning, this was just a political quid pro quo, a three-way political quid pro quo with Trump. Everybody kind of wins a little bit. The UAE are like, we managed to cancel Palestinian annexation. And Netanyahu can say, look, I'm bringing peace with Arab nations. Trump can say, look, I'm brokering peace in the Middle East. Everybody wins. Now, even if that's true, and it is to a certain extent, there is absolutely that aspect to it. And I think that's true for most moves like this in the history of politics. I think that politicians do care about their legacy and do care about the ability to tout achievements like that. And there are material gains from that. I mean, I'm not saying like in a bribe way, but I mean, being a president that got peace or whatever is something that can pay you actual dividends later in life. And again, for your legacy, even long after your death. But this was always true. Here's the thing that a lot of the critics ignore. The criticisms that they're making of this are situations that were true during previous peace accords too, and even before, meaning the peace accord with Egypt is still deeply unpopular in Egypt more than 40 years after the fact. The peace accord with Jordan is deeply unpopular in Jordan. And frequently, every time something happens, every time there's some kind of clash with the Palestinians, people in the parliament in Jordan put forth proposals to cancel the peace agreement, and they often just get overruled by the king or in some kind of procedural process, because it is not beneficial to Jordan to do that. I'm sure the U.S. also puts pressure on them to not do it. But my point is, nobody says this shit about those peace accords. Those peace accords were and still are touted as models, and the people who brokered them are considered heroes of these peace movements. And they were done above the heads and against the wills of the peoples of those countries, to the point that Sadat got assassinated over it. And the person who assassinated him is now a national hero there. And so, where are those people to say the peace agreement with Egypt isn't worth the paper it's written on, if that's the reality of it? And so in that way, I don't see this as any different from those two things. It feels extremely in line, except for one major thing, which is that Israel didn't have to make like extreme concessions for this, which, by the way, if you go ask Israelis on the street, they will tell you they would love to go have hummus in Dubai. They would love it. It's usually the price they are asked to pay for stuff like this is too much for them. And so it's not that they hate Arabs or hate Muslims or whatever. It's just a matter of like them asking, really, in order for you to not hate me, I got to do all this shit just so you don't hate me? And so when an agreement like this just comes out, when they're just like, and again, I'm going to mention annexation in just a second, but when two leaders come out like this and say, like, look, nominally speaking, we're just making peace. Like, there isn't really we gotta do this thing. I gotta sell this to my people because they're gonna have to do a huge thing for it. It's mostly just like, hey, guess what? We decided we're not going to be fighting anymore. And so, yes, the big concession that Israel made here was to give up for now, quote unquote, on annexation. Now, my take on this is that annexation was never something that was going to happen now. Sometime in the future, you can't predict anything. But I'm saying I think that Netanyahu... I think that his annexation carrot was always it was a carrot and a stick, but for two different entities. It was a carrot for his for like an electoral carrot, and it was a negotiational stick with the Palestinians. It was a threat to the Palestinians. Oh, if you do this, then we're going to do that. And at the same time, it was like red meat to the right wing. And in this year of like multiple election campaigns in Israel, he needed everything that he could get, particularly from the right, because there was a split. There were alternatives. There were right-wing alternatives. And again, I don't want to get into Israel's multi-party system, but the bottom line is that having a large right-wing bloc, but one that's split among many parties, was bad for Netanyahu. He wanted a powerful right-wing bloc that was mostly people voting for his party specifically, rather than just politicians who, largely agree with his policies. And that would make it easier for him to form a majority coalition. And so he needed to present himself as like more to the right, or at least like willing to do things that the other right-wing parties were saying that needed to be done. I don't think he actually wanted to do it. And I think he didn't think that the United States would go with it. And then he kind of painted himself into a corner, and I don't think he wanted to do it. And then there was this opportunity for the UAE to take credit for getting him off of it. And then again, it's a three-way quid pro quo. The UAE can claim this victory. They can both say, look what we did, and also use that to justify the normalization, meaning we took a brave step and we did it. We did this for the Palestinians. We didn't even do this for us. We're just secondary here. We did this for you. Again, Netanyahu can say, like, look, we got to postpone this. Again, brave move. We're doing this is peace. Are you kidding me? We're going to have peace with the UAE, and they got all this money, and we're going to cooperate in high tech, and we're going to create a coronavirus vaccine together. And again, with Trump, doesn't have to deal with the annexation crap, has a peace deal that he can take credit for, and he, again, embattled election campaign, really needs a big foreign policy win like this. Got props from a lot of like unexpected directions. I do think Biden is being smart in his high roadism. I think it's easy to just come out and say, hey, this is good, and the product of multiple administrations. Low key saying like, hey, I also laid the groundwork for this. But in the same way that the left has become so crazy that they set the bar low for Trump to be able to extract victories, they also did the same for Biden, because all Biden has to be is like Mr. Relatively, mild-mannered and say like, hey, good on ya. This is a good thing. To sound refreshing, like a refreshing liberal. Like, oh my God, where did these liberals go? And like all he did was not attack it. And so, yeah, like I said, it's this idea that this agreement happened on the backs of the Palestinians to some extent is true, because even if this was a big bluff, it's still their issue that's being bandied about here. But you know what? In a way, it's their own fault, because ever since the Khartoum Declaration in 1967, you could go Google this because I'm not going to explain it right now, but it was basically the moment that Arab countries declared that they would never make peace or normalize with Israel until it acceded to all of these demands, withdrawal to these and this and that border, and Jerusalem gave up Jerusalem and the right of return. It's called the Three No's. And it's basically been the policy of the Arab country bloc ever since 1967. And so the Palestinians basically tied relations between Israel and other Arab nations to their cause. And so the fact that then Israel kind of flipped the script on them and said, well, if it's so tied to the Palestinian thing, then here the UAE is saying, don't do this thing in your conflict with the Palestinians. And we feel so strongly about this that we will normalize relations with you if you don't do it. Then we're going to do it. Cool. If that's, in a way, Israel is kind of doing what the Palestinians want. They're faking them out. Like I said, they're flipping the script on them. But in a way, that was the deal. The deal was like, Arab countries won't make peace with you until you leave us alone. So Israel was like, okay, we left you alone. We're going to make peace with the UAE now. And the Palestinians were like, wait, no, because you didn't do enough and you didn't do what what we wanted. And in fact, what you did was you said you were going to do a thing and then backed out of it. Backed out of a thing you had no right to do in the first place. It's cynical. It's certainly cynical. And Israel plays dirty in this as well. You're never going to get me to say that Israel is perfect and that they never do things that are underhanded. And a lot of it is domestic politics. A lot of it is because there are people who are mad. People on the extreme right are mad that annexation was taken off the table for whatever price. Because much like the Palestinians, they say this doesn't change our problem with the Palestinians. Like the Palestinians are saying normalizing relations with the UAE doesn't change our problems with Israel. Except that might not be true, because now they're saying that there might be a cascade effect. Bahrain and Oman and Morocco, there's all kinds of other countries who seem to be lined up to now do this too because the UAE took the first step. That's another thing. When you have a united front, it's always hard to be the first person to step forward. But the fractioning of the Arab world, mostly because of the Syria war, but also because of like Obama and the Iran deal, it is made it easier to do that. And to just go back for a second to the criticism that that agreements like this are deeply unpopular among the people of Arab nations. This was always true. The thing that changed is it no longer became total geopolitical suicide to do something like this. It's always been unpopular, but on top of being unpopular, it was also dangerous to do it. Like I said, Sadat was murdered. And by the way, Sadat was not the first Arab leader to get murdered because of his seeming willingness to normalize relations with Israel. King Abdallah I, who was the current Abdallah's great-grandfather, was also assassinated in Jerusalem in the 50s because he was showing signs that he might want to normalize relations with the fledgling state of Israel. And so that was always the reality. And it's still the reality that things like this are deeply unpopular, but not deeply unpopular enough for even like a king to be unable to do it. And I think that in itself says something about where we've come in the world compared to, my entire life. I grew up in Israel and I lived there until I was 25. And I grew up in an atmosphere where it never seemed that anything would ever change because there was such a united front. But things changed a lot, especially in the past decade or so. And we're seeing things that, like I said, I never thought I would see in my lifetime. I said I might live to visit the Burj Khalifa, something I thought I would never be able to do. And I still think, and I've said this forever, I'm an Israeli-Palestinian conflict hawk, but not for the lack of desire for peace and not for the lack of feeling affinity to other Middle Eastern peoples and Arab culture. I've always been somewhat immersed in it and always been pretty close to it. And not just me, you can see if you go on social media, you can see a lot of love happening right now because Israelis feel really despised in that part of the world, and it's and that's also like the borders of the parts of the world that Israelis feel hated and shifts. Like when I was young, I was in Turkey back when relations between Israel and Turkey were hunky-dory before Erdogan came along, and it was great. You would go to like the markets in a place like Kushadasi, like on the Turkish Riviera, and like in the bazaars, the prices would be like in Israeli money, and they would get tourists to write them signs in Hebrew to get like people to come over to their stalls. A lot of love. Now it's kind of dangerous. You don't go there. You certainly don't speak Hebrew like on the street there. I said I feel about Turkey a little bit like you hear people talk about Tehran pre-Iranian Revolution, where Israelis would just hang out there, you know, in cafes in the streets of Tehran, and that sounds like imaginary, but now it's imaginary to think you would do that in Turkey, and now the prospect of you being able to do that in like Dubai is all of a sudden an option. The world is weird, man. You live long enough. I'm dating myself here a little bit, but you know, you live long enough, you see things you never thought would be possible, and not just like on the front of technology, you know, also on just the front of the world and what's going on in the world. Speaking of the front of technology, by the way, I think that is a great segue into the last thing I'm going to discuss, which is a little bit of a left turn, but I'm going to try to discuss it in a way that doesn't alienate people who are not into video games, because that's the thing I want to discuss just briefly, or not that briefly. I keep saying briefly, but I end up spending, just 10 minutes talking about each topic, which isn't that brief, I guess. I spoke on a previous episode about playing video games for stress relief during COVID recently, and how focusing on something that's under your control and allows you to do things at your own pace and tune out the world, because it's harder to just pick up your phone and read it when you're playing a video game as opposed to watching a movie or something like that. And so I just finished over this break between the last episode and this, The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. And it was one of my favorite gaming experiences of my life. And I just wanted to quickly explain why, because there's a meta reason for it. And it's funny, I just said, like, you live long enough and you see the world develop. This relates to when I was a kid, and I said that the cliche, oh, this game made me feel like a kid again, is weird, but it really is true in this case. It really did make me feel like I did when I played the original Legend of Zelda as a kid, and it was different from other games that I was playing at the time that were much more straightforward, like a Mario, or a Tetris. You have this game that isn't self-explanatory. It isn't like walk to the left, kill enemy, collect power up. This was a game that threw you into an environment and asked you to figure out what you were supposed to do yourself. Yes, there was a booklet, and yes, there were way markers and ways to figure it out, certainly. But it functioned differently from those more straightforward games, and brought with it this like joy of like exploration and solving mysteries. It taught me to look at video game environments closely, to recognize things that could hide something. And that central experience that I tried to break down into the three stages of exploration, puzzle solving, and mystery revealing were translated into a modern, large-scale, current-generation, open-world game in a way that very few similar modern iterations of classic games have done. And a big reason for this is that subsequent games in the Zelda series kind of departed from from the formula of the original in themselves. And so having a modern game go back to that original focus, where a lot of the story is stripped away, a lot of the more focused on-rails linear parts of the games were stripped away. And it just it's a sandbox game. It's a game where you can either stick to the story and finish the game, or do whatever you want for many, many, many hours. There is much to do in this game that will take a long time that is totally optional and you might not even know exists. And the fact that they managed to translate that sense of magic and mystery that was quote unquote easier to capture back then because it wasn't the era where everything has already been done a million times that we're living in now, is really impressive. I said it's a little like a magic trick where you sit down to play a game and all of a sudden you're back there where you're like, what is that thing? That rock looks weird. That tree looks out of place. And then trying to figure out if there's some kind of thing hidden there. Sometimes there isn't. Sometimes you end up spending a lot of time trying to uncover the mystery of something that is not, that just seems mysterious to you. You're seeing patterns where there are no patterns. Or sometimes you're just too early to be able to uncover a secret of something. You need to go back and get a different item. You need to trigger a certain quest. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh, it's that tree that I saw and jumped up on for an hour trying to see if there was anything related to it. Now there is. That happened to me many times in this game. And so I just wanted to address, again, a couple of criticisms of the game that I saw because I went and I read some reviews once I was done with it finally. It took me about 120 hours to finish. I could have spent another 50. I could have probably spent 20 or 30 fewer hours if I wanted to. I just didn't want to. I didn't do anywhere near a completionist run. I finished a lot of the things in it, but definitely nowhere near everything. And so one main criticism that I heard about it was that it wasn't super, super difficult, meaning it has a somewhat inverse difficulty curve where it's very hard in the beginning and it sort of gets easier and easier. I don't know if the enemy difficulty is scaled in a way that matches your increase in skill, but that's also because, again, it's an open world, so it's not like, oh, in level 8 and level 9 the enemies are very difficult because it's late in the game. You can go to any area at any time, and yeah, some areas are more challenging than others, specifically the areas closer to the final boss. But it is a little difficult to scale enemy difficulty. You know, you play something like Dark Souls, and so the bosses later in the game are just going to be harder because they know you're going to be better by the time you get there. But here's why I think that criticism is misplaced. The impression that I got at the end of this game was that the point of it was always to use your wits, including in combat. This game, more than many, many other games, gives you infinite options on how to engage in combat. You don't have to pull out your sword and, slash at the enemies. You can do all kinds of things to them. You can drop bombs on them, and you can lure them into all kinds of different positions. There's all kinds of explosive barrels and rocks you can drop on them. There are, so it's about your wits. And therefore, even the boss fights in this game are about figuring out the right way to defeat an enemy rather than becoming proficient enough in the combat that you can defeat very challenging enemies. Now, becoming very proficient in the combat so that you can kill a very powerful enemy and style on him and do it in cool ways is absolutely an option that the game gives you. There are enough combat options in the game to make it fun, and there are plenty of clips of people engaging in really, really impressive feats of combat in this game, but it is by no means the point. Again, it's not Dark Souls, it's not Bayonetta, where you need to learn how to be massively aggressive and lickety-split lightning fast on your move sets. This is not that. And so even the final boss, a lot of it is about spectacle, particularly Ganon's final form, where he's like a giant boar out on Hyrule Field, and you're galloping around him. And I saw every reviewer say, oh, this was the worst boss fight. It wasn't even challenging. And when I saw that part, to me, that felt like a post-boss. You beat Calamity Ganon, and that's it. You beat the final boss. This last thing was just a set piece, a dramatic set piece for the finale, where, there's this rising music and Princess Zelda is like, now Link, save Hyrule, and you got to do it. And and you fire this arrow right at its eye, right as the music crescendos. That wasn't a boss fight. It was just it could have been a cutscene. You could have just sat there and watched this happen. So instead, they just let you control your character during the final, the finale cutscene. And people complained because they got the feeling that because it was the last thing you did in the game where you had control of the character, that was the final boss encounter. I think that has more to do with video game conventions and people's expectation or people trying to fit the thing that they're doing into a previous mold. And so that didn't bother me at all. That to me was like a fun part. It was like, okay, we did it, and now there's just this one last task, because they give you a weapon. They give you like the light bow or something like that, and that's it. Like, you only use it there. As I said, that could have easily been a cutscene. And that, I think that was my main gripe with a lot of the reviews I got. Some of the criticisms of it I found were entirely merited. There's things of it become repetitive after a while. There's a somewhat lack of variety in both the shrines visually and the divine beasts. The divine beasts were of varying quality, and if you do the better ones first, which most people will, because I think the Zora one is the one that most people will do first, they get progressively less interesting. I think the Zora and then followed by the Gerudo is the way to go, because I think the Gerudo is probably the most interesting one. The camel is probably the most interesting one. And so starting with the elephant and then moving up to the camel is like a nice like increase in interestingness. And then the other two are way more simple and quick to do. But that also might be a result of you getting to know how to do them better, which again relates back to the problem of them being too similar. There's some UI issues, item management and stuff. A lot of that is just kind of minor gripe stuff. And I'm very interested to see what they're going to do in the sequel. The thing that I'm most interested to see how they tackle is the map, because you have the option of sending your hero to a totally different world, get a totally different map, maybe different monsters. That could be amazing. I don't think they're going to do that. I think they're going to keep it in Hyrule. And so the question is, how do you make it the same but also different enough to not just be a repeat? And how do you introduce new systems of content to that map that didn't exist in this game? And so there was a teaser video at some point. There's very little info about this sequel. The teaser video came out over a year ago, I think. And it seemed to show some kind of cataclysm happening in Hyrule. Big earthquakes and things rising out of the ground. And I think that's probably a really good idea. The idea that maybe there was some kind of other malevolent force that was just buried deep underground from the distant past, and something happened, and now all of a sudden it's going to come up to the surface with maybe dungeons coming out of nowhere. I think maybe cave exploration should be a thing, underwater exploration that gives you, like I said, use of the same map, but in new and unexpected ways. And so that if you have played the original a lot and you know the map, you know where everything is, you've explored around, that gives you some help, but it doesn't make you, master of the domain again. And some parts of the map might be very, very different after some kind of change like that, where others might be kind of similar. And I think that would be pretty cool. And so that's about what I got to say on Breath of the Wild. I might do a longer separate audio thing about it. just talking, like I said, a little more granular, like what things about the UI bothered me and what things I think they can tweak to the better. But that's generally my review of it. One of the best games ever made. Its flaws are extremely minor compared to what it achieves. And I'm currently playing Ghost of Tsushima, a new game, a popular new game on PlayStation 4, and taking a complete different, sort of setting a totally different pace of play. Way more story involved. It's way more about kind of set pieces, and it's dramatic. It is so dramatic. The intro of it is like a full body goosebump thing. And I did it live on stream, and I had a pretty intense emotional reaction to it. And then I looked it up, and it turns out it's a thing. You know, there's like compilation videos of streamers reacting to that one moment, and it's a pretty universal reaction. It is incredibly well crafted as a sort of cinematic gaming experience. It is a very much movie-like. You feel like you're playing in a movie, and the combat is designed to feel very movie-like. And when it works, it's combat that is rhythm-focused. It's not button mashy. It is in the sense that Dark Souls is rhythm-based combat, meaning that you need to factor in the swings, and you need to factor in what your enemy is doing and when you need to parry and when you need to dodge. And this is a lot like that too. So you have these like sword fighting sequences where you need to like block, attack, dodge, attack. You know, you got to like flow with your enemy. And like I said, when it clicks, when you kill 3 or 4 enemies at once, you could just go back and look at it, watch it, and it just looks like a sword fight from a movie. And it's just very fun. It really does make you feel like that exhilaration of watching a well choreographed fight scene. And I think on that note, I'm gonna end episode 4 of T3F, tentative title, tentative format. Thank you for listening again. This is hopefully on iTunes right now or soon-ish. Maybe you're listening to this on iTunes or Spotify. If you are, awesome. If not, it should be soon. I'm doing it. And that's basically it. You can check me out on Twitter at Neon Taster. You can go to my YouTube channel. You might be on it right now, but if not, youtube.com/c/Neon Taster. You can see me finish Breath of the Wild. I uploaded my final Breath of the Wild stream, which also includes a version of the comments I made here. I'll probably upload my first Ghost of Tsushima stream soon. You can also see previous streams of Breath of the Wild, Nier Automata, Horizon Zero Dawn, and some other games, Doki Doki Literature Club. I played a bunch of stuff on stream and had fun with it. Did wacky voices. I think they're worth a watch. And those streams that I do are on twitch.tv/Neon Taster. Like I said, more Ghost of Tsushima streams coming soon. And you can download this in MP3 format or also listen to it on Libsyn. That is neontaster.libsyn.com, LIBSYN. It stands for Liberated Syndication. I am Noam, and you've been on T3F.